Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our discussion on Europe in the post-COVID-19 world. Could flexible Europe work? My name is Elena Kucko. I'm director of the GLOBSEC Policy Institute, broadcasting from Bratislava, Slovakia. This event forms a part of a two-year-long research project, DIFF, European Governance, Potential of Differentiated Cooperation. It is an international project that explored the potential for flexible modes of cooperation between European Union member states. The project is implemented with the support of Erasmus Plus program of the European Union, namely the Jean Monnet project. With me today are fantastic speakers from across Europe. We have Alexander Stup, Director of the School of Transnational Governance, European Union Institute Florence, and former Prime Minister of Finland. Dr. Heather Grabby, Director, Open Society European Policy Institute. Kinga Brudzińska, Head of Future of Europe Program, GLOBSEC Policy Institute, and the lead of the project. Noel O'Connell, Executive Director, European Movement Ireland, and Alexander Beribes, representing the Department of Democracy, Rule of Law, and Political Parties, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. This event is live streamed and recorded. If you're Zooming with us, please use the Q&A function to pose a question. You can also tweet your questions at us or post them on Facebook in the comments to the live stream. Let me start by thanking our esteemed speakers for joining us today. Over the past months, the moods have been swinging in Europe. Our collective failure to find quick joint solutions to effectively curtail coronavirus crisis have led to a crisis of faith in the European Union itself, especially among the hardest hit countries. The past 2 weeks, though, have been defined by the discussion on the EU recovery plan that needs to put Europe on a better footing to get out from the economic crisis that follows. With the Franco-German proposal, the moods have swung to the better. The proposal was called surprisingly ambitious. Of course, that's given that for many, the Franco-German motor hasn't been delivering on the expectations in the past. The Commission proposal also gave a positive feeling that Europe is determined to get over the multiple crises we're facing. The readiness, though of course it's not yet unanimous, to take on common debt is widely referenced as a Hamiltonian moment for Europe. As we know, Alexander Hamilton federalized debt in the post-revolutionary US, creating a financially strong nation. I'm wondering, though, whether it is even better to call what we are going through a Hamiltonian moment, named after Prince Hamlet, the Shakespearean character. As you remember, Hamlet had to go through all kinds of existential crises. His country is under attack, family falling apart, the throne is gone, and Hamlet simply doesn't know whether he needs to act decisively or not. He considers suicide. He complains about his life, but eventually he contemplates that alternatives are worse. He is afraid to die because of uncertainties of afterlife. He doesn't kill himself. Well, he dies later, but that's not by choice. I wonder whether Europe is in a Hamiltonian situation, and whether, like Hamlet, Europe is asking the famous question, to be or not to be. The crisis Europe is going through is arguably so severe that fears are it might bring an end to the common European project. If Europe does not invest in saving its economy and livelihoods, it would be committing a suicide. The Franco-German and Commission proposal seems to be a sign that Europe is deciding to be. There seems to be increasingly shared understanding that however difficult the path is to reviving Europe, the alternatives are much worse. What is your analysis? What does the crisis tell us about Europe? And what do the current proposals indicate about our capacity to overcome the existential crisis? I will turn first to Alex Stup, who's been with you through quite a few crises already.
Great. I've unmuted myself, so I'm okay. Good morning to everyone, and nice to see you. And regards from Helsinki. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for the introduction. I'll make a couple of general remarks. First of all, I'm glad you qualified the quickness of the European response, because I actually think that the European response has been remarkably quick to this crisis. If you compare it to the financial crisis with which I worked from 2008 until 2016, and also if you compare to the reaction to the refugee and asylum crisis in 2015. On the financial crisis, it took the better part of 4 years to get it right, arguably. This time around, it took the better part of 4 weeks to come up with, I would argue, game-changing and in many ways far-reaching proposals. I also would like to perhaps warn against over-dramatic or melodramatic language, in the sense that I think we as human beings have a tendency to do three things. One is to over-rationalize the past. In other words, look for Hamilton or Hamlet for solutions. We have to over-dramatize the present. A lot of people are talking about existential crisis, be or not to be, do or die. And then we have a tendency to underestimate the past. And I think this is what we're seeing in the European debate as well at the moment. And I say this as someone who is not at all cynical, quite the contrary. I just think there's quite a natural logic to European integration, the way in which it works. And it goes through three phases. You know, phase number one is crisis. Phase number two is chaos. And phase number three is a suboptimal solution. And you know, that's what's going to happen this time around again. So my take on this, and I'll finish off with 2 points. My take is that we usually take one step back in integration in order for us to go 2 steps forward. The example in the COVID crisis is that in the beginning of it, we basically froze most rules and regulations linked to the internal market. So we froze the free movement of goods, we froze the free movement of services, and we froze the free movement of people. And also, we started in a flexible way to interpret both state aid rules and competition rules. And of course, on top of that, we started to give the Growth and Stability Pact a rather flexible integration. So that's the one step back. But then the 2 steps forward come actually with the Commission's recovery proposal, the 750 billion euros with 250 billion in loans, 500 billion in grants, and the 1.1 billion MFF at that. I say it as a 2-step forward because for the first time, I would argue in its history, we can really truly start talking about what has been branded as social Europe. If you look at what the European Union or the Commission did in its Trust program and its SURE program, it's basically getting very close to what we would call social Europe. And if you look at the proposal coming from the Commission on almost 10 billion euros for health-related aspects, again, you know, we're starting to see the embryo, or what I would call social Europe. What we will see in the next few weeks is a fairly classic debate between, well, to a certain extent, the North and the South, which I find rather artificial. We will see between the Frugal Four and others. But at the end of the day, I think this is much more about an ideological debate in Europe. It's more about left and right monetary policy. And that's what we should be focusing on. And understand that the Commission's package it's all about macroeconomics and finance, very little to do with bookkeeping and accounting. But I'm afraid that politics will lean us towards bookkeeping and accounting rather than macroeconomics and finance. So I think this is an exciting moment actually for the European Union. And I'm not saying this only because the Commission's program was Next Generation EU and my program for Spitzenkandidat was Next Generation Europe. And I'm not saying it only because I finished my Spitzenkandidat program with the words, "This is Europe's moment," and so did the Commission's proposal as well. So thumbs up for the proposal, and I'm sure something good will come out of it.
Thank you very much, Alex, for the introductory remarks, but also for giving the Commission the very good slogan and the direction for the work, regardless of who is at the helm of the Commission now. Heather, and I will turn to you. Do you agree with this assessment, especially whether we're over-dramatizing it and underestimating the past?
Well, there's always a tendency for governments of any kind to overestimate what they can do in the short term and underestimate what they can do in the long term. And crises do not bring out the best in the EU. The EU was not designed to be a crisis management instrument. It lacks tools to fight crises. So many of the key decisions have to be based on consensus among 27 member states who've reacted and been affected by this crisis in very different ways. As Alex says, the EU has learned the lessons from 2008 and has actually taken action a lot faster, to its credit. But really, this is not what it's good at. And so I think it's actually, crisis response is not the metric by which to measure the success of European integration. Instead, you need to look at what the EU does over the longer term. And I think longer term, the EU is still working, thank goodness, unlike many national governments that are very distracted by the crisis. But the EU institutions are still working on the very long-term issues that are vital to prevent future crises of this kind. So working on climate, for example, keeping going with the European Green Deal, also looking at bringing better governance into the digital sphere, particularly the public online sphere, and keeping those things, and in fact, I think speeding up towards a green recovery is absolutely vital if we don't want more crises like this to come in the future. So, you know, as Alex said, there's what the EU tends to do in reaction to each crisis is over time it builds policies and institutions, sometimes to fight the last crisis, to fight the last war rather than the next one. But European integration does it's pushed forward often by the need for crisis response. That provides the urgency, but often that takes quite a long time to build. Think about the European semester, for example, which has proved to be quite important in providing the guidance to countries in this crisis. And it's set out new kinds of guidelines, but which took a while to get going. That wasn't the immediate thing. But I would argue that in terms of the Hamiltonian moment, I think that's a very nice way of thinking about it. Acting decisively or not, yes, of course you have to act decisively as far as you can, but that's not really what the EU was designed for. And I would actually quote Churchill here, that you know, he very famously said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that we've tried from time to time. Well, the European Union is the worst way of organizing crisis response, except for all the others that we've tried from time to time in Europe over history. And if we had a more fractured, more nationalistic response with less coordination and with less solidarity, we would all be worse off. So the fact that we've got this far is something to celebrate. But what's key now is to take a good hard look at what will be needed for the next crises and not simply fight the last war.
Thank you very much, Heather. And that naturally brings me to Kinga, who's been leading the project over the past year. Kinga, we hear now that first, it's very important not just to look at the crisis and how to address the wounds that we had that led to the current crisis, but also what kind of policies we need to invest into right now and establish right now to prevent future crises from happening and set EU on the better path. And there, for example, Alex mentioned that we can talk now about social Europe truly, and that there is some consensus about the Green Deal. From your experience, and also what have you learned over the course of this project, how do member states approach this integration and the future of Europe? Do you think that there will be more nationalistic responses, or there is a convergence surrounding the certain areas of policies that will lead us to the better EU in the future?
Thank you very much, Alenka. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for the interventions. So our report was consisted of, we started to build the different scenarios for 4 policy areas. We focus on the Eurozone and Schengen zone, also on foreign policy and the European defense. But also we conducted an expert poll on flexible cooperation in the EU. And I will maybe here focus on this because it will also reflect on what is going now. We mentioned before the frugal four and the division between the member states, and also how now negotiations regarding the budget or recovery or broader future of European integration will look like. For some time, Visegrad countries were seen as this negative group of countries that were not constructive in the EU. Now we can see that frugal fours are mentioned more and more often. Both, of course, member states has their own rights and interests. So when we asked our experts in the member states, what do they feel about flexible cooperation, and is it the direction that actually the EU will go? So we were looking mostly on a kind of a French vision and a German vision. What we learned that there is no consensus among the member states. Actually, maybe it's not the most towards the flexible cooperation, even though they, under some conditions, they are transactional and instrumental. They say they will go for more smaller formats of cooperation only if it serves their national interests and they have a freedom to cooperate. So they say, yes, more rapid response on the EU side, quicker, smaller circles of integration, but it does not mean the divided Europe. So still the there is a preference for uniform process rather than the willingness to participate in the smaller circles. Some of the experts called it maybe the model of we are talking about the flexible unity of the future of information, of European project. Another finding was exactly about the communication. So it all depends how this process is communicated. While member states, they feel very, they looked very suspicious when we call it two-speed Europe or core periphery, but the concepts like multi-speed Europe or flexible Europe is less provocative. And the frameworks of enhanced cooperation as it happened in defense, and our research also shows that the PESCO is the most popular format of cooperation among the member states, are the concept that actually the member state lacks. So it also all depends how we communicate. What was important as well, that often the member states at home, they shape and they communicate and they show that this flexible or multi-speed Europe is not good for given member states. But on the other hand, when they are back in Brussels, they sign up for the smaller formats of enhanced cooperation instruments that are available. Which will follow me to our last argument, that it also depends on the size of the member states and their influence in Brussels. So less influential and the smaller state says that, yes, we want to participate in the smaller formats of cooperation, even not all member states are there, even though we don't agree with the multi-speed Europe, but then we sign up because we want to be on the table. We don't want to be excluded, and we want to be at the core of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kinga, for outlining these dilemmas and especially bringing in the discussion on the small member states and the scope of flexibility for them in the Union. I want to go with that to Alexander, who is joining us from Germany. And I'm especially interested in your perspective and your explanation on the change in the German position, whether you think this is a paradigm shift, be it on the ideological left-right discussion or frugality spending discussion that will be sustained for some time and will define Europe in the future, or you rather feel that it is a attempt to make it a temporary one-off exercise that will be retracted back in the future, and we will kind of make maybe not 2 steps forward, but 3 steps back.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be a part of this panel. Let me first maybe say something on the narrative. I think it's very important what Alexander Stubb said about the dramatizing. This crisis illustrates indeed vulnerable areas of the European Union. But at the same time, it shows that the European Union is strong. European Union is needed. We have in the European Union the so-called European Union Civil Protection Mechanism, which was used since 2011 more than 300 times, and which we use also now. We helped China. We use it now in case of strategic emergency assistance. And I think it's very important to push this positive narrative that Europe is not passive. With regards to the financial perspective, we see that the European Union, as European Central Bank, reacted on the crisis in a coordinated measures. And afterwards, the finance ministers of the Eurozone found a solution. And then simply another long perspective solution was needed. Therefore, the decision of like the Macron, Merkel initiative is for me not so much surprising, to be honest. Because first of all, we are before the German presidency of the Council of European Union. The French presidency will be in 2 years. We need a long-lasting perspective, and we need to build bridges. We need to build bridges between the Frugal Four. We need to build bridges and talk to the Visegrad states, and we need more democratic procedures. And that's why it's going now, this proposal of the Commission to the Council, and then all national parliaments will have to agree on that, also the European Parliament. If you take a look at the German discussion right now, that even Friedrich Merz, who is one of the politicians who is very critical about such matters like the initiative between Macron and Merkel in normal times, he says it's simply needed because we cannot lose another generation. Right now, we have to invest in the future. So the biggest narrative is not kind of looking to the past and judge this initiative according to what was the discussion before, but what is needed for the future. And we cannot lose one more generation.
Thank you very much, Alexander. And I'm going to move to Noel. Noel, you have a very interesting vantage point. You're from Ireland, and it's very interesting to also hear your perspective on what we were discussing now, whether the EU comes out with the image of being a strong union, and especially how it plays out in the countries that are affected by the decision, for example, of the Great Britain to leave the EU. But also, I know that you've been doing a lot of work analyzing the differentiated responses, but also the perception of citizens of these differentiated responses. Could you please lead us through that?
Thank you, Elena, and thank you very much to Kinga and colleagues in GLOBSEC. Yes, greetings from a sunny Dublin. So for once, it's nice to be speaking to you from a good weather. We were delighted in European Movement Ireland to have had the opportunity to participate in this very timely project and report. And Elena, as you asked, there are some perspectives from the Irish side of things. And interestingly, as a small island, we see ourselves very much at the heart of Europe, but as a bridge between the US and Europe, and then obviously a unique perspective on all things Brexit. Obviously, as somebody from Ireland, I couldn't but not mention Brexit on a topic such as this. And I thought maybe what might be helpful, just in some of my remarks, give a little bit of overview on some of the topics that we touched upon, and also just to look at the whole area on the future of Europe and how we see that the potential is there and the requirement and the necessity, touching upon what Alexander, Alex and Heather spoke about earlier, there's a real necessity for Europe to continue to up its game, and I think it has, in terms of promoting, branding, marketing, and communicating what it does for its citizens. We are in an increasingly competitive, interconnected, globalized world that is being challenged in terms of fundamentals of democracy and rule of law at both ends of the spectrum. And I think the EU has a really important role to play in that. So a little bit like to paraphrase Monty Python and the Life of Brian film, what has the EU ever done for us? Frankly, a lot. It has, and it will continue to do so. And it needs to remind its citizens of its role in that regard. In terms of the COVID pandemic and the initiatives undertaken by the EU is interesting. What I think we can say is that the EU was somewhat slow coming out of the starting blocks, but this whole process, as Alex outlined, in terms of the economic recovery and measures to mitigate the worst impacts of COVID, is a marathon, and it's not a sprint. And we've got to continually remind ourselves of that fact. But whatever way, in terms of Kinga and the report that GLOBSEC did, the excellent report, regardless of the differentiation and the views of a different integration and a multi-speed Europe, what is unacceptable is a multi-speed Europe with regard to democracy and the rule of law. And it is imperative that all member states are unequivocally unified as regards the preservation of those democratic values and the prevention of democratic backsliding in terms of the responses and some of the challenges we have seen to that. Now, in terms of the Conference on the Future of Europe and that whole topic, every year since 2013, we in EM Ireland have carried out a survey of attitudes towards people in Ireland on a number of different issues in relating to our relationship with the EU. And it was interesting, we saw a Brexit bounce, paradoxically, in terms of support for Ireland's membership of the EU. What do I mean by that? Well, last year, support for Ireland remaining an active and committed and engaged member of the EU stood at 93%. This year, however, that had fallen to 84%, still very healthy, still very positive, but the biggest drop since we have been doing these surveys nationwide since 2013. And what that outlines to us is that we cannot take our membership of the EU for granted. And what was very worrying, one of the findings we asked was, do you feel in Ireland as a citizen of the EU that your voice is heard and understood? Only 33% agreed with that. So the majority of people in this country feel that their voice as an EU citizen is not heard. So I think that's a salutary warning. And in terms of an Irish perspective, with the withdrawal of the UK from the EU, it forced us to appreciate our European unity and our membership, notwithstanding our geographically peripheral island nature. It forced us to look at how we were going to deal with our closest partner in trade and countless other policy areas, but also enabled us to reevaluate and to look afresh at our existing relationships in the EU and to expand on them. And this, I think, is a really good role model and a template for the support and the solidarity, and in terms of the COVID pandemic, that the EU, its institutions, and all member states need to continue to support and engage with all of the different countries in a variety of policy areas, as the other panelists touched upon, in terms of migration, enlargement, the economic stimulus package, and mitigating the worst impacts of the COVID pandemic for all citizens of the European Union, regardless of where we all happen to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noelle. And I will go back now to Alex. I wanted to pick up on two issues, but of course, feel free to make any other comments on the interventions of the other speakers. First one is when you were talking about this emerging move towards a truly social Europe, of course, at the very beginnings. And when we were talking about different positions of states, I was wondering whether, how would you convince, let's say, Central Europeans that social Europe is not a protectionist maneuver from the Western states, because there are always opinion in Central Europe, or I'm sure any other states, that social Europe is nice, but we simply are not competitive if we raise the salaries and the social protection to the Western levels, and hence it's perceived as a move against the single market and something that will not be for the benefit of Central European countries. And the second point that I wanted you also to build up a little bit upon is this no differentiation in democracy and the rule of law. How in practice do you think we can achieve that, and how many strings, democratic strings, will be attached to the next European budget?
Yeah, sure. I think on your first question about social Europe and the internal market, I mean, to simplify, I would say that the internal market bakes the cake and social Europe divides the cake. And of course, traditionally, I don't think we would have what we call European welfare states, was it not for the single market and the four freedoms and anything related to competition. Now, social Europe has been very much an issue of rhetoric throughout, I'd say, the past 20 years or so. I mean, first, the German CDU has spoken much about a social market economy. You know, French left and right are both talking about social Europe, and it's sort of a very difficult concept to be against. But I think the whole term has been rather wishy-washy from a European perspective over the past decades. But now, for the first time, money is being spent on what could be called serious social policies. I think the Trust program and the SURE program, which are linked to unemployment and others, and SMEs are examples thereof. I also think that, if I recall correctly, 9.8 billion euro proposal on health is another example thereof. I don't think Central Eastern Europe, or Northern Europe for that matter, should be so much worried about social Europe being a smokescreen for protectionism. I think they should be more worried about the potential of industrial policy or industrial Europe or strategic autonomy type of issues being used as a protectionist smokescreen. And I think they should be more worried about, you know, the volumes of state aid that we're seeing, right or wrong, at this particular moment. And they should be more worried about the fact that we have in many ways lost the champion of the single market with Brexit. And then, you know, we get into the question a little bit, okay, you know, what's going to replace this? I really liked your example of Visegrad versus Frugal Four. I hate to say it, but perhaps Frugal Four is not seen at the moment as a very positive concept inside the European Union. I was not involved when the Hanseatic League was set up. I had just left office as a Minister of Finance, and I must admit that I'm not a big fan of that. It sort of came at a wrong time. I don't see it that much as it should be a champion of the single market. It's more been seen as a champion of austerity, and I think the Frugal Four are now taking that over. So if I was Eastern and Central Europe, I wouldn't be worried about social Europe as such. Look at the other attacks, I think, on the single market. Then the other notion that you mentioned, which I think Noel raised very well, on I hadn't thought about it, differentiation and democracy, but that's a wonderful sort of way of expressing it. And here we have to be, I think, very vigilant, because my argument is that, you know, if you don't stick to the basic values, what the European Union stands for, then we have nothing left. And we also have very little claim to, by way of example, to expand democracy around the world. So that's why I must admit that I have been extremely worried about what we have seen in Hungary over the past few years. And I don't need to push Heather on this, coming from Open University. And that's why I took very strong issue with it as well, or as strong as I could as an EPP Spitzenkandidat. I have also been extremely worried about what I've seen in Poland. And what we're seeing, I think, around the world right now are these sort of, I call them macho men trying to find space in sort of not destroying democracy, but at least in a questionable manner, interpreting it rather flexibly. What does bring me faith in this whole thing is, if I want to be a little bit mean, is that I think all the macho men have been exactly the worst in dealing with the COVID crisis. You look at Putin, you look at Trump, and you look at Bolsonaro. I mean, they basically screwed it up totally. So, they will lose some street credibility on this. Should there be conditionality? I say yes. I mean, I definitely think that what Frans Timmermans and others were pushing for in the last Commission mandate is important. We have to have sanctions if basic values are not sort of lived by. So this is my 2 cents worth. But again, I say this. I try to say this to Alexander as well, sort of without over dramatization, because I think these things have a tendency to sort themselves out. But when we get to the really, really fundamental issues about freedom of expression, academic freedom, rule of law, independence of judiciary, then we are in serious territory, and we have to be very careful. And therefore, to Kinga, I say no differentiation on that field. And congratulations for the report, by the way.
Thank you so much. And I saw Heather reacting very engagingly on the comments about democracy. I know you've done a lot of work on that. Heather, what is your take on maintaining the values and democracy in Europe, wider Europe, not necessarily in individual countries? But also, when you were talking about the policies that the European Union needs to adopt to move forward, that includes, for example, green recovery, social policies, how do you feel, is there overwhelming support among the population across Europe in favor of these policies?
Well, there's certainly overwhelming support for the values themselves. People still really care about them, including in, for example, Poland and Hungary. And we did a very interesting poll last year, which showed quite clearly that people still want to see pluralism in their parliament. They still want media freedom. In Poland, they're also pretty keen on the rule of law, for example. So I think it's important to look at what people really want as opposed to the political rhetoric. And I think the differentiation debate and the flexible integration debate is getting quite muddled up, because the key thing is which forms of flexible integration damage the single market and which forms are actually quite safe for the single market. So let's think about it in terms of what kinds of flexible integration the EU already has. So one kind is the don't want to, that's the opt-outs, for example, Sweden and Denmark not joining the euro, or Ireland not joining Schengen. Then there's the can't get in kind of flexibility, and that's, for example, Romania and Bulgaria not being allowed into Schengen. Then you've got the kind of formalized, structured cooperation, which, very interesting, as Kinga was saying, there's actually a lot of support for, particularly from the smaller member states, because of course it prevents them from being excluded. It sets rules of the game for cooperation. And also what she said about PESCO, the way that, that's a form of flexibility that's already there inside the institutions. But the really dangerous form of flexibility is UDI, is unilateral declarations of independence from EU law. And the reason why that's dangerous is because it is used by governments that want to undermine the values. For example, Viktor Orban he made an extraordinary speech in which he was saying, you've got to respect our diversity, that we in Central Europe, we have different values. And so you've got to respect our diversity and apply flexibility here. But the problem is that this has a massive impact on the single market. Not only does it have undermined democracy and values and so on, but it actually challenges EU law, which prevents a level playing field from existing. If you can't rely on the courts in a member state, I think of Poland here, for example, to enforce contract, then it's hard for businesses to invest and to be, and indeed for individuals to be sent for trial by their own judges in another EU country. So it has all kinds of implications. Plus, of course, now we've had the challenge to the primacy of EU law and the primacy of the European Court of Justice from the German Constitutional Court, from Karlsruhe, which is a different kind of challenge. It's not intended to undermine the values, and I suspect the judges have had a few sleepless nights about the impact that their judgment has had, the way it's been taken up quite willingly by those who don't support support the values, because I think on the whole they do support the values. But what they've tried to say is, actually, we as a national court can override the EU court. So if you combine the combination of the kind of unilateral flexibility on values, unilateral imposition by a national court or a claim by a national court that it has primacy, plus also all of the distortions that can happen through this crisis, because member states have very different capacities and willingness to give state aid to their companies. They are huge challenges for the single market here. And I think that's what we need to watch out for, because it's absolutely vital that that continues to function really well. And it's being undermined in ways that are not really being understood at EU level. There's lots of hand-wringing, there's lots of, oh dear, what a shame, and oh, this isn't good. But there's very little concerted action to prop it up and to go back to the idea that actually the community of law is the bedrock for the European Union. It's the reason why it's possible to have crisis response in a moment like this. It's the reason why you can have long-term frameworks at EU level that can set the global norms on digital regulation, for example, can start a Green Deal in Europe that could influence the Green Deal across the rest of the world. That's what gives the EU its power, its regulatory power, and also its external power. If we lose that, then we really lose any hope of solidarity also between the member states. So I would argue that we're at a very tricky moment for flexible integration. We've tried out various forms of it. There are some parts that can work well, but the unilateral forms are really dangerous.
Thank you so much, Heather. I'll bring it all to Kinga to give us a Central European perspective. Also, forward-lookingly, all the issues that we've been discussing here, democracy, but also single market, social Europe, do Central Europeans feel like the recovery package is in their interest? Do you think, what are their preferences and demands, and whether they're going to be signing up for that?
Thank you, Alenka. I wanted to refer also to what Noel said about, and then it was repeated, about the democracy and rule of law. This was definitely mentioned as a no-go for any kind of flexible cooperation in our report. And the other area was actually migration policy, because here it depends from the perspective and the countries, member states on migration. From all southern member states was mentioned as a policy where they cannot just be left alone. Migration crisis hit them very fast, and they would really expect more solidarity in the future when it comes to the distribution of refugees or tackling the crisis. From the areas that were most interesting, always the new things and that brings freshness. So the areas that were mentioned and most popular was the defense and European Public Prosecutor Office. Those are the formats that are coming up, and actually the new proposal from multi-annual financial framework did not cut that much for common European defense, which might be an argument that this area the integration will even further accelerate. When it comes to Central Europe, it's actually very interesting. It's obviously very there is no one Central Europe. I'm a Polish and I'm living now in Slovakia. So even now I'm discovering Visegrad countries now from the perspective I didn't see before. Poland also always perceived itself as a leader of the Visegrad group because it's the biggest country, the stronger voice in Brussels. While in Slovakia, when you are sitting 2 hours from Budapest, 45 minutes from Vienna, and 4 hours from Prague, Warsaw is far away. You know, so those are even those small things that they have also different history. Poland is always further or outside. If you have to bring people for interesting discussion or consultation, of course now Zoom does magic and digital transformation. But yes, this is the partners you first invite and you talk with. And I have, when it comes to Hungary, I have a very interesting quote for one of our contributors to our report, who said that flexible cooperation, even if practically useful, raises immediate concerns that are deeply rooted in the national myths, traumas, and the social complexes. And I think it's also the same comes with Hungary. We don't want Europe to tell us what we should do. This is how we reform our judiciary system. This is good. This has not been, we didn't do a good job after the fall of communism, so we have to improve and reform system. This is the argument that comes back, at least in the discussion in Poland. When it comes to approaches of Central Europe, the most kind of countries that are most active in these different formats of cooperation are Baltics, no surprise, small countries, and Slovenia. And the least active are Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Croatia. I'm talking here about the instruments that we have, 6 instruments that we have in the treaties of the European Union for enhanced cooperation, Eurozone, Schengen spends, but also we took into account the French-led European Intervention Initiative as something that might show us what other groupings will come out. When it comes to the recovery package, I think it's just a perfect moment to show that Eurosceptics cannot complain that EU is not doing much or is cutting funding. In Warsaw, nobody can say now that EU does not support transformation, recovery, and is just doing nothing, so we don't need them anymore. Therefore, it's a perfect timing and a perfect moment that also shows that Brussels EU is having a broad picture and is thinking about member states and the future of European integration.
Thank you very much, Kinga. And I want to move to Noel and Alexander with the same question. And I want to dwell a little bit more on the single market and the challenges associated with it currently, but also how it plays with the Europe global economic power and the strategic economic autonomy that is increasingly being discussed. Both Ireland and Germany are interesting cases because, for example, the German state aid, as Alex mentioned before, is actually a significant one and arguably it can have influence on the way single market can function. And Angela Merkel herself was saying that she needs to do some talking with Brussels to explain even the funding that is given to Lufthansa and so on. But also in Irish case, there's an interesting example because now there's a lot of talk that, for example, EU should have common rules on the digital taxation and especially taxing of the big corporations, including the American ones. And Ireland had some issues in the past from not being very eager, enthusiastic to go along these lines. So I wonder about your perspectives, how the single market will play out, especially in the areas of state aid, industrial policy, and digital taxation. But also, when we are talking about strategic autonomy, and somebody mentioned that it might lead to more nationalistic responses towards the relocation of industries and so on. Some countries actually hope that we're going to treat single market as one unit in terms of the relocation of industries. And for example, if we're in Central Europe are concerned about the future of auto industry, we might be in the good position to benefit from the near-shoring or relocation of, let's say, French or German companies from Asia, not back to France or Germany, but into Central Europe. Do you think this is something that is feasible and this is the way forward for the single market? Noel, would you like to go first?
Sorry, Elena, thank you. Yeah, I might just start off actually by, I enjoyed Alex's reference to macho men. I might say, thankfully, it's great that we have some fantastic females who have been to the fore in some of their respective countries, such as Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel and Elizabeth Ardern in New Zealand. Elena, you asked a lot of questions there, and I'll do my very best in terms of
the ones that you like.
The ones that I like. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think in terms of the single market and the recognition and importance of of promoting innovation and flexibility in that regard. Obviously, one of the champions of it, and ironically, one of its main creators in terms of the UK and Brexit, the proponent of free trade and a real country that espoused the benefits of the single market in terms of the UK and Brexit leaving, that has created a significant challenge here in Ireland in terms of the single market. But we saw very clearly that from an Irish economic and business perspective, we want to prioritise our membership of the EU single market because we recognise the benefits that are afforded to us as a member of that. And central to the recovery from COVID-19 will be Europe's economic policy and measures that are enacted to rebuild, restart and repair that recovery. On the digital tax issue, absolutely. I think that is it's one of those topics. It hasn't gone away, you know, and it won't, and nor should it. And I think it's certainly something that needs to be looked at a broader European and global level, because it's not just an EU issue. These are huge multinationals with a global footprint, and unless measures are taken at a wider international level, the responses will be insufficient. And interestingly, that was another topic that we posed in our national survey in terms of whether people in this country felt that Ireland should give up its veto on tax at the EU level, allowing the EU 27 member state governments to take decisions on tax by majority vote, and 51% disagreed with that. So it's certainly a policy that needs to be looked at. And I was interested in Kinga's summary and topics, and just in terms of the peripheralization of member states, particularly in Eastern and Central Europe. When we are looking at ensuring that the economic recovery is going to be balanced, it's going to be durable, and obviously the European Green Deal will be a huge aspect of that, is that we have to ensure that you know, reasonable and restrained differentiated integration, and it's imperative that this multi-speed framework, that it operates within defined limits. Because what we would see is that this differentiated integration is intended to facilitate gradual inclusion rather than gradual exclusion. And through that solidarity and unity, that's where the future of Europe is. We tend to say here that we tend to nationalize success and Europeanize failure. Perhaps there is an onus and a responsibility now on all EU member states to maybe reverse that a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander.
Thank you very much. These were really important points. I just would like to add from the German perspective, it is very important for Germany to smooth out the narrative that Germany takes care only of itself or supports only Lufthansa. That's why this initiative is so important, Macron and Merkel initiative. That's why the proposal of Ursula von der Leyen is so important. That's why Germany is pushing these ideas and will push these ideas during the presidency to build bridges and to focus on the future topics, European Green Deal and digitalization. And digitalization is actually a very important topic, and Germany is very much supporting, or was supporting, the proposals of Japan last year, G20, kind of an international order for data flow, cross-border data flow, that we tackle this topic, that we kind of find our role as the European Union in the digital world between these big powers, China and the United States, our ethical aspects, our ethical approach, together with friends, also in the Aachen Treaty. This is a very important, has a very important place. And to focus on unity. I think the most important is indeed this narrative that Germany is a strong country. It's not it's known, but we want and will help Europe to be successful.
Thank you so much, Alexander. And we have 5 minutes, so I will give the speakers the 90 seconds each for the last remarks. Your last advice on how we can make 2 steps forward, what the steps could be, and how to make them. Alex.
I think the Commission proposal is a good starting point, and what I almost find sort of positively amazing is I'm not saying near consensus, but the sort of welcome approach that we're seeing from many of the member states. I think we need to look at this in 3 phases. You know, first phase was the lockdown. I'm not saying it went well, but at least there was some coordination. And now we're starting the second phase, which is a gradual opening. And there, I think if we want to take the 1 step back, 2 steps forward, it needs to be very well coordinated, because the virus might be symmetrical, but the shock economically and otherwise is asymmetrical. And then in the third phase, when we go for a fully fledged opening, I echo all of those who say that we need to make sure that the integrity of the internal market is preserved. And I think if we do these things and we get it right, I think we'll do quite well. I'll just give one final point, and that is to say that this also has geopolitical implications. And I'm a very strong transatlanticist, but I think there are going to be 3 power centers: China, the US, and Europe. And I actually think that Europe could be very geopolitical in this. In other words, play ball 75% with the US and 25% with China. Stick to your values, but use this opportunity and use it to the fullest.
Thank you very much. Kinga?
Thank you, Alenka. So I would say I would just have a few two remarks for the EU. Act fast, be flexible, and build bridges. And for member states, respect diversity and show solidarity.
Thank you very much. That was very concise. Noel.
I can't top that. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the EU is to continue to represent, safeguard and uphold its best values, ensure that we transition out of the lockdown and mitigate the worst impacts of COVID in as unified a way as possible, and protect, safeguard the integrity of the single market, and ensure that we don't enable the prospect of an asymmetric recovery, because that will only continue to exacerbate inequality, fan the flames of Euroscepticism. But I think the Commission's proposal is good, it's positive, it's faithful to existing environmental digital commitments, and we need to seize this moment to make the EU and Europe more effective, more functioning, and uphold its values on which it was founded.
Thank you very much. And Alexander?
Yes, thank you. I think that the Corona crisis accelerates the developments which we saw before. It just makes it faster, also with regards to Russia and China. And I think we have to have a clear stand, a clear position on both countries, and that's why China is going to be also one of the priority topics during the German presidency, and Portugal will deal with India, as we know now. Regarding United States, I agree fully with Alexander Stubb. This is the most important country. This is an ally and partner, and despite the turbulences with the White House, we need to think long-term and to cooperate with the United States as closely as possible. And with regards to digital aspect, plenty of chances also in regards to the participation, digital participation, and how we communicate political narratives. And towards the multi-speed Europe, I would just underline that there are areas where multi-speed Europe is unacceptable. And this is, of course, in the area of rule of law. And we need to be very, very patient, and we need to act also very strongly if values are put in question, not only from outside the European Union, but especially from the inside.
Thank you very much.
I can come in briefly, Alenka. You can't see me, but if you can still hear me.
Okay, but nice to hear you.
If you can still hear me. Yes, I think the absolutely key thing now is to implement the European Green Deal to achieve both the climate objectives, but also the social objectives. Bringing together social Europe with green Europe is the way to show that the EU really is on the side of citizens, that it's there to provide accountability, for example, of governments to citizens, but also of corporates, particularly in the supply chains that now everybody understands are so vulnerable and are full of exploitation, both of the planet, but also of people. So bringing the social and the environmental goals together under the Green Deal is a way of providing a new boost to European integration, particularly for the younger generation who understand very well that they will be most affected by climate change, as well as, of course, by digital. And this is also absolutely key to bringing the member states back together with a common challenge, something which there's no way that any single country on its own can tackle climate change. The EU is manifestly needed here, and there can be flexible ways of doing it, but you've got to have a common effort and a very long-term framework. And that's what the EU is really good at. It's good at long-term frameworks, building consensus slowly, deliberation, negotiation. And that's also the way to prevent the future crises that will come inevitably, but to reduce them at least because of climate change. If we can't cope with a pandemic from a disease like COVID, how are we going to deal with the extreme weather events, the insect-borne diseases that could come because of global warming, and all of the other massive disruption that will inevitably come with climate change? The only way we can manage the challenges of the future is to build the EU's capacity in this domain.
Thank you very much, Heather. Thank you very much, everybody, for the great discussion. We're leaving our participants with the important thoughts that we need to make sure that our steps forward are well coordinated and we're working to the longer framework that the EU is best is, that we remember that it is unacceptable to have differentiated integration on democracy, that we need to merge social Europe with a green Europe to demonstrate also to the citizens that the EU on their side, but also need to remember that everything that we're doing internally has huge implications on the geopolitical position of Europe and what kind of role Europe can play in the world. Thank you very much, everybody, for being with us for this hour, and we're looking forward to seeing you with us again.